All right, everyone, welcome in to the latest edition of IDP Drafts, brought to you by the IDP Show. Today is a special episode compared to the others you've seen in the feed. We've always focused on IDP. The previous episodes have looked at IDP and IDP-only drafts. Tonight, we're going to be taking a look at IDP in some combined leagues that use offense players as well. And I couldn't be more excited to be joined by Eric to talk about these for two reasons. One, the guys always talk about him as one of the best IDP drafters out there, and I've seen it firsthand between probably the 15 or 20 leagues that he and I have been in, and just today, he sniped me on Jalen Phillips just hours ago. So I know he's a great drafter. I know I've done a lot of these combined leagues with him, so I think that's a really great perspective to bring tonight. And also, like I mentioned, I'm in multiple drafts with Eric, so I'm trying to get a little bit of a competitive advantage in my leagues. And what better way to do that than to learn his strategies and his mindset, although I'll also be sharing mine, so it's kind of mutually assured destruction. But either way, Eric, I'm really excited to have you here tonight. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to getting to do this with you and talking some combined drafting. It's something we haven't done on this platform. So it's super exciting to talk about.
Yeah, so we have two overarching goals for this session. First, we're going to talk about just some general strategies, because approaches in some ways are very similar when you're doing a combined draft, but in other ways, you change things up a little bit. You know, one of the most difficult places for a lot of people who do combined leagues is when to draft IDP or what mindset to go in terms of how to value IDP versus offensive players. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those general strategies in these combined leagues, as well as some of those most common questions about how early is too early to draft IDP. Do you change your strategy? And we'll also touch a little bit on best ball versus managed leagues. And then we'll dig into the ADP that we have. So we've been running some combined best ball leagues since early July. So we have data from 6 leagues so far. And Eric and I both dug into that a little bit to look for some values, some reaches, some overall trends that we found interesting. And so we're excited to be talking about that with you here as well. So let's start off. Eric, what is your general approach whenever you have one of these combined drafts?
Going offense early. I prefer to fill my offensive starters up before I do a defensive player. I don't always do that. I've played around a little bit. I actually took Max Crosby in the 6th round in one, and I found that I'd rather not do that. I'd rather wait a little bit longer. So I do like to go offense early. I usually wait till the 8th or 9th round, somewhere in there. I'm looking at what's the value of the player I'm drafting versus what else I could get at another position. Mm-hmm. You know, what's the drop off? If I'm looking at Max Crosby, who are the receivers or the running backs available, or there's some likely to fall to me in the next round that I would be happy with, just as happy as the one I would take in that spot. So that's kind of what I look at any position I'm drafting, is obviously what positions do I need to fill yet, but what the value is compared to the rest of that draft or that position, and then what's the other positions look like. So do you have a bunch of running backs that are about the same value? Now I'll wait on the running back till the next round. If maybe the top 4 or 5 defensive ends are gone, maybe that's the time to pull the trigger on Myles Garrett or somebody like that. Yeah. Instead of waiting and ending up with somebody that's kind of a tier drop off down. So it kind of depends on where you're sitting to in the draft. If you're on the ends, it's a little easier, at least on one end, but then the trip back is a little longer, so it gets a little bit different and trickier there. I've been lucky to be in the middle of quite a few. I don't know if that's lucky or not yet, but usually it's 10 to 12 picks. I'm trying to figure out who's going to fall to me the next round and what that value looks like compared to the position I might take. I like to watch the bye weeks in these combined drafts because you don't have quite as many bench positions. You're looking at maybe 2 to 3 spots behind each position that you're drafting. So you kind of have to look at that a little bit in these drafts versus our IDP only best balls where you got a bunch more bench positions. I don't pay attention to that at all. So in this, I don't want to get a 0 week any week from a position. So I do that a little bit. The IDP side, I look for flexibility. I want the dual desi still, again, because you're only going to get a few backups at each position. The IDP flex helps a little bit. Those two positions on these drafts with some of that, but yeah, I'm trying to balance that out with some dual desi. And I think you've got on those drafts, there's 36 total roster spots.
Yep.
And 16 starters, 8 on offense, 8 on defense, with 20 bench spots. So if you think about that, that's just a touch over one bench spot for every starting position you have. So I kind of want to make sure I'm okay on my bye weeks. And I thought I was fading defensive backs, and I wasn't really. So I thought I wanted a solid option or two at defensive back, and I just don't know. I think everybody's drafting defensive backs a little bit sooner, and so I would see, I'm in the 20th round, 22nd round, 23rd round, and I can get somebody like Justin Reed or somebody like maybe Metellus, somebody that's a solid option. I'm like, okay, it's not too early. It's 20th round. But I'll go into a little bit more later. I found that I'm actually a little early on defensive backs in that way, that there's solid options at the end of the draft, and there's no reason, I think, going forward in the next few of these that I do, or however many more we do, I'm going to be probably waiting towards the end for defensive backs based on what I've seen in the ADP. And so, yeah, pretty much wait till the 8th or 9th round is what I'd prefer to do. And I just kind of watch what's going. Every draft's a little bit different. See who's going, where the drop-offs are coming, and just try to watch for those.
Yeah, and I really like the point you made about bye weeks. That's one thing that I haven't been paying as much attention to, and I think it's in part because I was so hardwired for all of the IDP only best balls we've been doing earlier in the summer to not have to worry about that at all, because you end up with 8 or 9 players at each position in those leagues. And so I think you're right. The bye weeks definitely play a much bigger role in these. I'm also with you on, hammering offense early and often. So I try not to be too rigid, because I know when you get too rigid with strategy, it can bite you often. But I do have more rigidity in these combined leagues than I have in many others. So my general approach is like yours, to go offense early. But what I'll do is I won't even look at IDP until my offensive starters are all filled. So I want to make sure that I have that offense in place before I start to consider IDP, because of the relative scarcity of positions. If you think about just a football play, you have 6 offensive players that can score a point on that play, and you have 11 IDP that can score on that play. So when you look at the distribution of points, the tail on the right hand is much, much longer for IDP. There's a lot of viable IDP later in drafts. And if you miss out on offensive players earlier in drafts, you're not really going to have those options later on, especially when we're talking best ball, when you don't have the opportunity to pick up that running back who emerged out of nowhere, or the tight end who filled in for an injury and started playing well. So I don't even really consider IDP until my offensive spots are full. And then I use kind of a combination of a financial approach to it. I see it as a market. I know Jeff Ratcliffe has talked about this before when thinking about quarterbacks in superflex leagues. He'll say, I won't draft my first quarterback until X have come off the board. So I apply that same sort of mindset with IDP, in that once my offensive starters are all filled, and sometimes I'll fudge that a little bit. I'll wait on quarterback or tight end and get some more running backs or wide receivers. But once I've hit that round, so in these, we're talking 8 offensive starters. So round 9 is the first place that I would consider an IDP, but I'm only going to look at those IDPs that are ranked in the top 12 overall of IDPs. So they are essentially a first round pick in an IDP only draft. If they're sitting there in round 9, that's a market signal for me to move into IDPs. And I'll take my first IDP there. And then the next round, I'll go back to offense because I want to build that depth because of the scarcity. And then the next round, I'll do the same exercise. Is there a first or second round player there? And if there isn't, I stick on offense. And if there is, then I go back into that IDP well. So I do a lot of alternating after, in this case, with 8 offensive starters, round 9, round 10. I'll do a lot of bouncing back and forth because there's still incredible value to be had in IDPs that late in drafts, whereas offense is already starting to get pretty barren. So that's how I approach these combined drafts in terms of when to really start. But I know you mentioned Max Crosby as someone that you took early. One question you always get whenever we're talking to people doing these combined drafts is, when is it okay to start taking IDP? I know we always want to zig when others are zagging. I feel like you may have hinted at some regret about taking Crosby early there. What is your general thoughts on this?
Yeah, eighth round is the earliest I really want to take an IDP. Kind of like what you were saying. When I took Crosby in the 6th, I realized, well, the receivers that were there that I could have taken, that I was thinking about receiver was my other option. And I still got a decent receiver on the way back. I was happy with that. Wasn't much of a drop off from the one I could have gotten in the 6th round. So in the 7th round, I did fine. The problem is at the end. So now you've pushed down those other offensive positions a little bit farther. So it's not that particular pick. It was towards the end of it where now you're maybe not quite as happy. And there's still some good IDP players out there. And so it was a little test, and I wasn't happy with that one. So now it's been 8th, 9th round. If I'm down to one offensive player left and I see, it looks like there's going to be a good one coming back to me, then I might take my first IDP, get a good solid, like you said, one of the top 12 guys. In the 8th round, I've gotten Foye and Nick Bosa. Was happy with that. And then 9th, I got Ernest Jones and another. So those were all, and my other 3 that I've done, those were my first IDP picks in those 3. So I can think I'm on board with what you're saying. I think we're doing something very similar there. I just am not quite as rigid about it as you are, depending on what those players look like.
Yeah, and I think the other point you mentioned earlier too about where you are in the draft order is also going to change some things. So if you are on that tail, you might have a mindset like me of, I want to get all my offensive starters, but you might realize that, look, there's only one of those first round IDPs left at the end of the 8th, and you may still have, one starter that you need to pick up, and you're going to have 22 picks before you're able to come up again. So in that case, I can see maybe going a little bit earlier, but, I really do like, if we're talking, I know in other leagues you start 11 offensive players and 11 IDPs. So for me, those would be round 12 would be when I'd first start looking at. It's always that number of offensive starters plus 1. I know there's the mindset of get your guys, and it feels great to be able to get Watt or Parsons or Crosby. But like you were saying, when you look at the players that you have to give up to get them, the offensive players in particular, and the IDP that are still there a round or 2 later, and we'll come back to that a little bit later when we get into ADP, it's not worth the value drop off to me to get that very top IDP. So I very rarely, if ever, have any of the top 5 or 6 IDP. Usually I'll end up getting maybe 11 or 12 of the IDP overall in that 9th round or whenever it is that signal sort of converts over for me. So yeah, I think we're definitely in agreement there. If you love a guy, get him, but don't do it and wreck your offense in the process. So wait at least until your offense is pretty well set before you really start to make those considerations.
Yeah, if you look at, so let's take Nick Bosa, for example. Some are more, if you look at consistency throughout the season. And in best ball, it doesn't matter as much because you're getting the best week, depending on what players, you're getting the best score. But if you look at consistency of offensive players versus week to week versus the consistency of defensive players, typically the offensive players are more consistent. Mm-hmm. So a reason to fill your offense up first, you're more sure of who's going to have value than you are on the defensive side. Not like you said, the first 12, first 24, pretty consistent with linemen and linebackers, but yeah, it's a consistency thing on the offensive side. You know what you're getting a little bit more, I think, in general.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Another thing that's a commonly asked question whenever we think about these combined leagues is, do you change what you do in terms of your approach to IDP? Does it change how you value some IDP positions relative to another? Or if you're a linebacker first guy in IDP only drafts, you're still a linebacker first guy in combined drafts. Do you do any changes, or do you kind of stay the course whenever you're thinking about a combined league?
I pretty much stay the course. I'd prefer to have my defensive lineman first, but it just depends, I guess, on if I'm waiting on IDP and other people have decided to take the defensive lineman, and I've stuck with offense. And I've gotten Foye and Ernest Jones, 8th, 9th round. I'm not opposed to doing that first if that's how the draft ends up. It just really depends on, as we talked about earlier, where the value is in the positions.
Yeah, I think that's an important point because, like you mentioned, you might want to draft edges early, but you might also not want to draft any IDP until round 8 or 9. And by the time you get there, if you stick with that mindset, you might be passing over a Foye or a Roquan for one of those more second or third even tier edges, depending on the composition of the draft. So I think you're right that there is a little bit more flexibility than you need to have, because you can't tell exactly how the draft is going to unfold in these combined leagues nearly as much as you can when it's IDP only, in terms of when the IDP are going to go. And as we'll talk about with the ADP, the order even in which the IDP will go. But I'm mostly aligned with you in terms of my general approach doesn't change much. But one thing I have noticed, having done 6 or 7 combined drafts so far this offseason, is I am hammering dual desi even more so than I do in regular leagues. And I think I was able to pinpoint the reason why I'm doing this is in an IDP only league, on Sleeper, which is the only place you have dual desi. So if I'm doing a combined draft on MFL, I'm using my same mindset of I want a stud linebacker, I want a stud edge, and then I want to aim for upside and some floor to fill it out. But on Sleeper, when you think about these IDP only drafts, you're really only filling 3 positions in a flex. You've got DL, you've got DB, you've got LB, and whatever the flex are. So the dual desi is nice, but I'm also just as happy if I end up with 10 stud DLs that only have DL eligibility, 10 stud linebackers who I'm confident with. But when I think about these combined leagues, I'm not filling 3 positions anymore. I'm filling 7. And as you mentioned, these leagues don't double and triple in size of the draft whenever you do combined. The drafts are the same size, if not a little bit shorter. So you're only going to have so many players at each position. So to me, that really does bump up the value of the dual desi players, because if you're someone who doesn't take, say, a top tier tight end, it gives you that flexibility to take maybe 3 tight ends in the back end so that you have a little bit more of that coverage. Or if you punt quarterback and take quarterbacks late, you can go with a 3 quarterback build if you have a lot of those dual desi guys who are going to be able to fill either of those slots. So generally speaking, on MFL, my mindset's exactly the same. Sleeper, I've always liked dual desi. I think it's a nice bit of flexibility. But when it comes to these combined leagues, that just really bumps the value of dual desi for me.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at earlier is you got a shorter bench. I mean, it's a big bench, but with all those positions, it's really not a big bench per position. So yeah, the dual desi is really important. It's kind of like IDP madness in that way. Mm-hmm. The dual desi is more important there too, because you've only got 24 spots and 14 starters. So you got a real limited bench in there too. So kind of the same thing. Dual desi is really important in these drafts.
Yeah. So the last general thing before we start to get into some players and what we've seen in the combined ADP is, we've talked a lot about best ball, especially in the IDP drafts feed. And that's because it's a really fun way to play. We do a lot of those drafts, but we're also in, the heart of some combined redraft seasons, whether you're just in a home league and you've been brave enough to add IDP at some point and you're doing a redraft there, or some of the big tournaments like the Invitational where we're in the same division. So how or does your strategy change at all whenever you're thinking about how to tackle IDP and IDP only leagues that are best ball versus these more combined leagues that are managed instead, where you have to set a roster on a week-to-week basis?
Yeah, it's definitely different. So in managed lineup leagues, I want some consistency in the players I choose. I want guys that I think are going to be pretty consistently hitting points. I know what I can expect from them every week, rather than the boom bust type players where you don't know when you're putting them in your lineup what you're getting, and you could easily lose a week or you could easily win a week. It becomes more of a 50-50 proposition the more of those guys you have in your lineup. So in best balls, it's different. In the best balls, I'd like to still have some consistency, somewhat of a base of consistency, but then I want to focus on the boom bust guys. And people look back at last year's stats and their scores on Sleeper and say, oh, they scored 200 points last year. Well, how did they score those 200 points? Was this or more when you get further down in the draft, especially some of those? Now, all your stud players, you kind of know those first 8 rounds, who's going to get picked where. When you get later in the draft, is this guy scoring 7 points every week? Or is this a guy that scores 2 points one week and 25 the next?
Yeah.
And I want the guy that's going to score 25 in a week because he's more likely to hit your lineup at some point during the season than the guy that's just pretty consistently 6 to 8 points. And he might get in there a couple times if a few guys have bad weeks, but it's not going to be an exciting getting in your starting lineup, So I look more, if you're going to look at last year, look at those guys that get the sacks and things like that, the big plays that they have as you're getting deeper in the draft, especially the guys that have the opportunity or the chance to get you a boom week or two. And if he counts a couple times during the year, great. I'll take it over a guy that's maybe never going to get in my lineup.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. Those safe plays are a lot bigger in your leagues where you're actually managing a lineup on a week-to-week basis, and the boom bust. Something I will do sometimes if I'm in a league that requires 2 linebackers, I'll get one a little bit more boom bust linebacker, someone like a Logan Wilson or a JOK who has some interceptions, might get a sack from now and then some more of the steady Eddie linebackers who are just going to get you the consistent points. But honestly, when I think about these combined leagues as managed leagues versus best ball, the managed leagues really just turn the dial up on everything that I was saying previously. So if my general rule is, all right, if we're starting, say, 10 offensive starters, to not look at IDP until 11, well, in these managed leagues, I know I'm going to have to be setting an offensive lineup every week. And I know that I'm going to be able to hit the waivers. I'm going to be able to stream corner. I'm going to be able to stream defensive tackle if you're really brave and you miss out on the good ones. And so I am going to be a lot more likely to wait till round, in that example of a 10 offensive starters, 13, round 14, to really build out some of that offensive bench, because I know the IDP are still going to be there in the draft. And I know the waiver wire is going to be pretty barren for offensive players in season, but there are always going to be a lot of really good IDP out there to be able to stream. I had Chris Jones as my starting defensive tackle in one league last year, and on his bye week, I cut him, and Christian Wilkins was out there. You're not having that same kind of thing on offense. You're not cutting Travis Kelce to pick up Sam Laporta and play him for a week. So to me, whenever you switch into those managed leagues, it really just accentuates even more that importance of building a strong offense with depth, even if it's at the expense of losing out on some IDP studs, because you're still going to be able to find a lot of good IDP value. and in part because of all the resources that are out there. Anyone can go on Fantasy Pros and look up the consensus rankings for offensive players, and they're pretty solid. There's not that same real resource for IDP. I know they have consensus IDP, but it's only a handful of folks, and a lot of places don't send their best and brightest to add to that. So, you have a lot more predictability and consistency on offense, and so you can't afford to fall behind. So that's the one big change that I have when I think about best ball to manage is it just, I don't want to say deprioritizes IDP because that feels dirty on something called the IDP Drafts podcast, but it does reprioritize when you should start really attacking IDP because there's just going to be more of them available there.
Yeah, and that's definitely true, and it's true for auction leagues too. If you're in an auction league or an RSO league, you're not going to see, say, Deontay Johnson slip through and people forget about him. Mm-hmm. Kind of an okay receiver, not great, but good. You're not going to see George Pickens slip through and people have forgotten about him. But in an RSO league here recently, Harold Landry slipped through and I got him for the minimum contract.
Oh my gosh.
People forgot about him. And you happen to be down the list a ways on RSO, and I got him for the minimum. And immediately I was one of the last people that had players left to get. Immediately bumped it up to a 4-year, $500K per year contract. And boom, I've got him locked in. So nice. That stuff can happen on the defense. Not always going to happen, but it can. I saw Macri get Highsmith that way. And I was kicking myself that I'd already filled that position when he did it, and oh man, I was mad. But it happens more often than you would think, where those guys can slip through, and that's just not going to happen on the offensive side. You're going to find value late in drafts or late in auctions with IDP.
Yeah, and those guys you mentioned are top 10, top 15, at worst top 20 edges. Yeah. I couldn't imagine any universe where there's a top 20 wide receiver or running back just sitting out there on waivers. No matter how incompetent an owner might be, they're not going to be cutting those guys. So I think this is a real good insight.
They were both contract leagues. So the contracts had expired, expensive to re-sign them. So they get thrown back because it was too costly to re-sign them. So not every league is going to be like that, but it's just kind of driving an overall point of IDP. You've got more chance at the end, later in drafts to get somebody good than you do with offense. They're not going to be missed.
Yeah, absolutely. So far our conversation has really been very philosophical about, how to approach IDP in these combined drafts and differences and how early is too early. Let's dig into what we've actually seen in some of these combined leagues. Part of the reason why we launched these in early July was to build out some good ADP so that we could have some actual data to throw at some of these answers and to see what really stood out at us compared to how IDP are being valued in the IDP only best ball leagues. So when we think about these combined leagues and this combined ADP data set, Eric and I both spent some time today, deep in the sheets, looking through what's been going on in these combined leagues relative to the IDP only leagues and just how we value some players and some other options that are there. So we've nailed down a couple of players who we think are showing up as real values in these. And again, as a disclaimer, this is based on 6 leagues. We've got a lot of really good players in it, but I know there's a lot of recidivism where folks come back in league after league. So some players might have their ADP artificially inflated or deflated a little bit. It's not like, the great 26, 27 league data set that we have for the IDP only, but it's still a nice insight that can give you a leg up on your competition, especially as you're heading into more of these kinds of drafts or any of these drafts that you have to go. So when we think about players who stood out as a potential value, Eric, who's the first person that jumped out to you?
Well, I'm really glad you asked me to do this show because I hadn't been diving into the ADP. I'd done 4 combined drafts, and I really thought with the limited number of bench spots that I needed to grab a couple of solid defensive backs. somewhat early just to make sure I had that position locked up for the most part. And that is not true looking at the ADP. So a couple guys I have were Hufanga and Mathieu. And really, my gosh, the safeties that are available at the ends of these drafts, it's ridiculous. There's no reason to need to get a DB until late. So Hufanga is going in the 32nd round.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great value. Tyler Rapp, 33rd round. Mathieu, 34th. Pinnock, 35th. Poyer and Justin Simmons are in the 36th round. Justin Simmons hasn't even been drafted in 5 of the 6 drafts that were in the ADP. I think that's going to change, obviously, with him getting signed by Atlanta, and people will be looking at him more. I mean, people should have been knowing he was going to get signed by somebody, and maybe where he gets signed, he's going to play no matter where he gets signed. So, I mean, if you think about that, you've got 4 or 5 guys there that you could draft at the end of a draft and be fine on defensive backs and not have to worry about them before that. And there's good corners in there too. When you've got limited spots, I'd rather go with the safeties and the corners when you have fewer. You can't throw as many people at it in these drafts. So the up and down of the corners and trying to get past his defense and all that is a little bit riskier than you can get with safeties with the tackle floor, unless you're getting the slot corners or somebody. But so that was my first was Hufanga and all those safeties, great values at the end.
Yeah, you mentioned Mathieu as well. What is it that attracts you to Mathieu? He's one of those steady Eddie guys, and that he typically performs. He's not, the highest ranked safety. He's been doing it for a while. He had a ton of buzz coming out of college where everyone wanted the honey badger because they saw all the incredible plays in college. But I think he's become a little bit of an afterthought in a lot of these IDP drafts, as you've identified. And his ADP is 400 right now. And these are, 36 round, 12 team leagues. So that's awful late.
Only 432 spots. He's 400. I mean, he's at the end. I mean, you can get him really late. And he's just, like you said, he's steady Eddie. He's going to get 100% of snaps. He's going to be on the field unless he gets hurt. He's going to make plays. He's got the floor, but he does make some plays on top of that. And so I just know with a short bench, I can rely on him to score me some points every single week.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Well, I went more linebacker heavy with my values. So the first one, and I went a little bit earlier in the drafts too. So you're getting a lot of different perspectives on different positions and different portions of the draft. But my first value is Fred Warner. And I know it seems a little crazy to think of Fred Warner as a value because he's usually a first or at worst second round pick in IDP only drafts. But if you look at where he's being drafted with an ADP of 104, that's the 9th round in these drafts where you start 8 offensive players. So I can't tell you, I've done 5 of these. I want to say in 3 of them, I walked away with Fred Warner in the 9th or the 10th. If I didn't sort of follow my own rule and went with another offensive player in the 9th and then grabbed him in the 10th. He's a top 12 IDP in the IDP only ADP. So he's a first round IDP pick in IDP only drafts. And if I can get a first round player like that after filling my entire offensive roster, let's go. That is the exact thing that I'm looking for with that sort of moving in and out of the IDP market that I was talking about before. And someone else who fits that same bill, actually, I said it was a linebacker. His brother's a linebacker, but Quinnen Williams has an ADP of 152.2. So again, that puts him in the 13th round of these combined drafts. And he's a consensus top 24 pick. If you look at the IDP only, so he's a second round guy that can be had all the way in the 13th round. So to me, this is just more of that evidence of you can build a really stacked IDP roster by waiting until the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. 2 drafts, I waited until the 15th to take my first IDP. My offense was marginally better. My IDP was significantly worse, so I probably wouldn't suggest waiting that long if you're only talking about 8 starters. So I basically had all my offensive starters and all my offensive backups before I even touched IDP. don't love those rosters as much. But if you start in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, now I could imagine Quinnen Williams being the anchor for your IDP squad. And if you can get him at 152.2 and you have a lot of great offensive players on your roster already, that's just the best of both worlds to me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Those are great values and anchors, as you said. And there's other guys even later that you can still. DeMarcus Lawrence is going in the 31st round, and David Long is going in the 31st round as well. And David Long's the green dot in Miami, and he's going in the 31st round. He had 800 plus snaps last year. I mean, to borrow a phrase from Mike Ward that he's just started using lately, what the gravy? What are we doing? Those are some good values late, and I mean, that's late. And those are solid. Yes. They could be your starter on your IDP side of the ball. Both of them. So it's, there's no reason to go too early on the IDP.
Yeah.
Like you said, you can wait too long and get kind of in trouble, but because you got to fill those 8 starting spots plus your bench. But there's some definite value out there.
Yeah. Well, on the flip side, so while there are definitely some values in looking at the ADP, and I agree, the ADP in the 20s is just littered with some green dot linebackers and some fantastic. I mentioned how you sniped me in Jalen Phillips. I think that's the 19th round that you got Jalen Phillips in earlier today, or somewhere around there.
So. Might even been the 20th.
Okay,
it was late. Yeah.
You don't have to go IDP early to have great IDP squads in these combined drafts. But some people do go IDP early, and in looking at the IDP combined ADP, you and I both had someone jump out. So I'll let you lay out your case for why this is going to be just a blasphemous take to some, but why this gentleman is a reach in combined drafts.
It's TJ Watt. I mean, yeah, the guy's been my favorite IDP to draft in the IDP only best balls. He's who I take number 1 if I'm in the 1 spot. The tiebreaker is the dual Desi between him and Max Crosby for me. So that's the way I usually go if I got the number 1 spot. But he's going at 28.8. I mean, that's the beginning of the 3rd round. What are we? Are you? Oh, TJ Watt. I love him. But my goodness, that's way too early. I mean, there's too many good offensive players out there, and I just wait a few rounds at least, at the very least, and if you can wait till the 8 or 9. I mean, are you going to tell me you're going to take T.J. Watt at the beginning of the 3rd round when you could have Foye Oluokun, Nick Bosa, those guys in the 8th and 9th rounds, that range? Why would you do that? So anyway, that it's TJ Watt, and it does sound blasphemous, but it's not that I don't love him. I do. It's just way too early to go IDP. And it depends on your scoring, of course. I do know of one league that I forget what site runs it, but they have extremely heavy IDP scoring where guys will score 600-700 points in a year. So that makes a little bit difference, but in most leagues, 99% of leagues, no, don't take TJ Watt in the 3rd round. Just don't do it. Wait.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I looked up the offensive players that were going around that same spot. So if you're taking TJ Watt, you're passing on Michael Pittman, Devonta Smith, Nico Collins, Sam Laporta, Travis Kelce, Isaiah Pacheco, Derrick Henry. Those are all people who went after TJ Watt in terms of ADP. Here's the other thing. If you were to wait just 2 more rounds, you can get Micah Parsons. And I know that you're a Crosby as 2. In my Madness draft that just started today, Parsons went 1, and then I got Watt at 2. I don't think there's a huge gap between Parsons, Watt, and Crosby. If you're telling me I can get one of those elite offensive weapons and an elite edge in either Crosby or Parsons, and the drop off is moving from Watt to Parsons, Crosby. If you talk about wide receiver, the drop off is Pittman to Zay Flowers. That's a much bigger drop off. Or Kelsey Laporta to Kyle Pitts. And these are all people who went just after Micah Parsons in our ADP across these 6 leagues so far. So I agree completely. TJ Watt is a big reach, and it's not just me hammering this idea of don't take IDP early and wait until X number of rounds. I can rationalize someone who takes Watt in the 7th, 6th, maybe, but the 3rd, I'm with you, is just, it's a bridge too far, and it's doing serious damage to your offensive side of the ball when no other IDP is going for 2 more rounds. It tells you probably could have gotten him a round later, if not even more.
Yeah, it's crazy. And can we consider Micah Parsons an offensive player now too? Is he going to play a little bit of running back?
I don't know.
Maybe I need to change my thinking on who I have.
As a Penn State guy, I would love to see him play every snap of every game because it's just a blast to watch him play.
Yeah, so, yeah, it was the guy that stood out. Like amongst everybody, don't draft TJ Watt in the 3rd round.
Yeah,
you're doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah. So the only other reach I was able to find, and part of it is, reaches are a little bit harder to find in this data set because these are all recent drafts. Some of the value that you can get from mining, even the post-draft ADP in the big data set for the IDP only best ball drafts, you have this recency bias, and you have all this new news and events and things like that are helping. I really expected David Long to be higher because it's been known that he's been the green dot for a while. But in general, you have most players that are being drafted are a little bit closer, or even the ones that feel like a bit of a fade. To me, it's closer to where I think they should have been all along. But one player who is a reach to me, in addition to Watt, so again, Watt was on my list too, is Ivan Pace. So I know he's being drafted relatively late with an ADP of 219. It's not really like middle rounds when we think about these 36-round drafts. But the value to me just isn't there. So he's being drafted in the combined drafts as the overall IDP number 57. But in the IDP only drafts, he's the 86th drafted. Add that to the fact that I just listened to John and Mike talk about kind of the bait and switch of all the enthusiasm of, oh, he's going to wear the dot, until we found out he wasn't going to wear the dot, and it's going to be Cashman. And people seem to have not really caught up to that. But if you look at, like I said, his overall positioning in the IDP landscape seems askew to me. But if you look at where he is just in terms of the other linebackers that are available, he's being drafted as LB 21 in the combined leagues, whereas he is 34 in IDP only. And if you look at the ranks, the 2 ranks that are out there that I rely on the most right now for linebacker, which is a position I don't do as many analyses on, are Adam and John. Adam has him as LB 42. And again, he's being drafted in these combined as LB 21. So half of his ADP. Macri has him as LB 50. So to me, I get the optimism. I get loving the story that he came out of nowhere and had a chance to wear the dot. And who knows, they might be tricking us all along and he may get it eventually. Or even if he doesn't wear the dot, that's not the be all end all. You can not wear the dot and still be out there for 95% of snaps, and he could put up great numbers. But to me, there are just so many better linebacker and safer even linebacker options out there for you than Ivan Pace at that part of drafts.
Yeah, and Macri, I think everybody knows at this point, loves Ivan Pace, and he still has him ranked number 50. That just kind of tells you it's not that he hates him. He likes him a lot, but he's number 50 based on his role in the defense and all that. And I would say pretty much any of the defensive players going before the 8th round, it's probably a little bit of a reach.
Yeah.
And like I said, I reached, and I will not do that again. That was the first one we did. That didn't work out. So yeah, don't reach for them. Actually, do reach for them so I can grab the offensive players.
Yeah, I was going to say,
and then I can get my.
But we want to give good advice, so stay with that first instinct. You know, the angel on your shoulder and not the other side. Don't reach. We want you all to be better drafters.
Yeah.
Beat the people who aren't listening to this, who want to draft IDP super early. But I think this is a nice segue into our last topic, which are just what are some general observations? I know you noticed that there are probably too many IDP going before that 8th round. What are, if any, some other things that stood out to you from that combined ADP data that we have over on the IDPshow.com?
I've already touched on it quite a bit, but it was the defensive backs for me was the biggest aha moment because I had been drafting them in the anywhere from the 19th to the 25th round, somewhere in that range. I'd start drafting a defensive back thinking I need to get somebody solid. And yeah, there is a drop off, but how big is that drop off? I mean, defensive backs, the top 12, the top 24 it changes over every year. Was it 34% of the top 24 or defensive backs from last year will be in the top 24 again this year? I think is the stat. It's a third.
Yeah.
So which 8 are going to make it this year from last year? You just don't know. So, yeah, I'm definitely changing my strategy based on what I saw on the defensive backs, and that was the kind of the biggest aha moment to me today, going through all this.
Yeah, and I had 2, one of which relates to DBs as well, and you know, it was surprising how much value there is still there at the very end of drafts. I mean, we sort of we know that from doing the IDP only best balls, but you imagine with this new format, it would move some things around a little bit, but it really hasn't. And there's still a lot of that value there. The one thing that it has moved around, which I'm still trying to make sense of, is how early DBs are being drafted. So I went and looked at the top 6 DBs that are being drafted, and they are Winfield at the 26th overall IDP in these combined leagues. Hamilton is 27. Derwin James is 40. Nixon is 47. Bates 49. Witherspoon 56. Okay. If you compare that to where those same players are being drafted in the IDP only relative to other IDPs, Winfield moves from 26 to 47. Hamilton 27 to 53, James 40 to 69, Nixon 47 to 171. Nixon hasn't been drafted as a top 100 IDP in any of the 26 drafts that we have so far. And I know these are return yardage leagues, and I love Nixon. I've been drafting Nixon not in the combined leagues. He's been gone well before I have any interest in the combined leagues. But in the IDP only leagues, I'm probably inflating Nixon's ADP with where I'm drafting him. And still, it's over 100 spots. Bates, 49 in the combined versus 101 in the IDP only. And Witherspoon, 56 versus 91. So generally speaking, I agree that, and these are all guys, if you do that math, that's all before the 8th round. It's all before the 6th round. Or I'm sorry, these are where they are relative to other IDPs. So it's not their overall ADP. But still, these are players who are being vastly overvalued relative to other IDPs. I get moving them up a little bit because, like you said, shorter benches, a little bit more priority. It's nicer to have some of those reliable studs, especially if you don't go dual desi and you're eating up more roster spots with just LBs and just DLs. But still, that was one observation to me that really jumped out. Like you said, the value in the back, but it's the overvaluing in the front, which was really surprising to me.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a psychology thing. You know, you're not going to draft those guys typically 3rd or 4th round of an IDP only draft. It's kind of known you wait a little longer. But when you're in the teens of the rounds, it doesn't feel as much of a reach, even though it is.
Yeah.
Because there's so many great IDP players. It's just a psychology thing. Oh, I'm in the teens. I can draft defensive backs, you know, but, and I think it has to do with, like you talked about, thinking that there's going to be a limited number. You want to make sure you get good guys, but because nobody's drafting very many, there are good guys at the end of the draft. So that whole thing, because people aren't drafting 10 to 13 defensive backs, they're drafting 5, maybe.
Yeah.
There's still a bunch of players available late in the
Mm-hmm.
draft. You don't really need to reach.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other observation that I had is related to a little bit of what we're also seeing in some of the madness drafts already. And that is linebackers going earlier than expected at the expense of edges. So if you look at the top 24 IDP being drafted in these combined leagues versus where they're drafted in the best ball only leagues. So when we look at the defensive ends, there are more of them obviously in the top 24 because it's so edge heavy, especially with the big three scoring. It's not as tackle heavy of a system, so it's going to reward more stacks and things like that. The edges are good at. But if you look at the edges in the top 24, 4 are being drafted higher in the combined leagues. 9 are being drafted lower, so later in drafts, and 3 have the same relative ADP in terms of where they're being drafted compared to other IDP. When you look at linebackers, 5 of them are going earlier than they normally go, and a lot of them are by 5 or 6 spots, and this is just in the top 24. So this would be like in the first 2 rounds of an IDP only draft, we'd be seeing more like 4 or 5 linebackers going in those first rounds, and we see only 2 that are being drafted a little bit lower and 1 the same. So there is in these combined leagues, and we're starting to see it a little bit in madness as well, and it'll be interesting to track this in other leagues as we finish off the offseason here. But linebackers are experiencing a little bit of a comeback after being pushed down in our ADP for so long. So to me, that was interesting. I don't know if this is a function of the offensive leagues and thinking more traditionally about IDP and linebackers were king for the longest time, or what it might be. But it's really, that was another interesting observation to me, how the general trend is to lower the ADP of linebackers in that top 24 IDP slots and to raise the ADP, have defensive ends drafted a little bit later in those early rounds.
Do you think it has anything to do with the volatility of the edges and how they score points versus the linebackers? And if you can get the steady linebacker with fewer bench spots, that it's pushing it up a little bit, or is that what people are thinking? Maybe
that could be. And honestly, you'll see this very shortly in another combined league that we're in. That's why I prioritize linebackers in managed leagues, because I want that consistency, especially in a place like MFL where they moved to true position and you deleted all of the outside linebackers because they got the designation they should have had all along, which is edge. That also shrunk the linebacker pool. So when I'm drafting on NFL, I prioritize linebacker a lot more than I do on sleeper. And it might be a little bit of that mindset of, I want steady points. I want consistent guys. Maybe if I draft 2 or 3 stud linebackers, then I can punt linebacker for a while and then return to it later. But to me, that's a better mindset for managed leagues than best ball. So even if that is what's happening, it's not really a strategy I would recommend as much when you're going to have your lineup set after the fact and you can have boom games and you have all these dual designation guys who have an LB tag on them who can have boom weeks for you, which really should deprioritize. I feel like the ADP for the IDP only drafts is pretty good in terms of the relative valuation of edges versus linebackers, or dual desi guys versus true linebackers. But this combined, it's hard to really put a finger on it.
Yeah, my solution has been the dual desi, to the shorter bench for each position. It's been the dual desi to give yourself as much flexibility. I just kind of wondered if that's what people are thinking is, I'm only going to have 5 linebackers on my team, or 6 maybe with the flex spot somewhere like that. Do I want to go early on them? I don't know. But yeah, my solution has been like you. I'm going to the dual desi so I have the flexibility and get those boom weeks in there.
Yeah. All right. Well, that wraps up our latest episode of the IDP Drafts Show. Been really excited to be here with Eric. Again, I'm Scott Soltis. You can find me at Professor IDP and writing for the IDP Show. Eric, where can folks find you?
On Twitter X, I am at Eric Harms FF, and I'll be doing some. I think you will be too, Scott. You'll be seeing us this fall on some Sunday morning start sit shows that we'll be doing live. I'll be answering your questions for you. So I've got some other things coming up potentially too. So follow me on Twitter.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, and happy drafting.